Welcome, friends. Settle in, get comfortable, and enjoy listening to our new original story. There are people who know how to take a hit so well that, from the outside, it simply looks like indifference. Claire Drake was exactly that kind of person. When, during a meeting in front of the entire board of directors, one of the junior executives tried to publicly humiliate her by stating that a woman with a mere economics degree had no place in serious corporate strategy. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't blush. And she didn't storm out of the boardroom. She silently picked up the meeting minutes from the mahogany table, flipped 3 pages back, found the exact clause where this very executive had signed off on a disastrous contract 6 months prior. A contract that had cost the company nearly $500,000, and slid the document across the table to him. "Please, continue," she said then. "I am very interested to hear what you have to say next." He didn't say another word, and a month later, his position was filled by someone else. That story was retold in the corporate offices for years. Some told it with admiration, some with fear, and others with poorly concealed envy, because Claire Drake, born Claire Russell, never allowed anyone to humiliate her. Not a single person in her circle could boast that they had seen her break, apologize out of turn, or swallow an injustice in silence. If she was silent, it didn't mean weakness, it meant she had already made a decision and simply didn't feel the need to explain it out loud. It had always been this way, and it was this way on the day that turned absolutely everything upside down. But to understand what happened on that day, one must go back many years, to where the story of the man who one day decided he could humiliate her with impunity truly began. Long before all of this, back when Claire was working as a simple financial analyst at a Wall Street investment firm and still went by the name Russell, an incident occurred that she herself later considered a kind of character test, an ordeal that either breaks a person or reveals what they are truly made of. She was 25 years old at the time. The head of her department, an older man named Winters, who harbored a particular fondness for belittling young female employees, threw a massive fit in front of the entire trading floor over a valuation report. In reality, Claire hadn't compiled the final version of the report. He had, simply forgetting to input the correct discount rates into the financial model. Winters screamed, called her incompetent, and threatened to fire her on the spot. Clearly expecting the young analyst to burst into tears or start profusely apologizing just to keep her job. Claire didn't cry, and she didn't apologize. She waited until he had exhausted his rant, and then calmly asked him to pull up the original source file from the firm's cloud server. The file metadata clearly displayed the date and time of the last modification, as well as the username of the person who had made the edits. That user turned out to be Winters himself. "If you feel it necessary to terminate me for your own clerical error," she said then in a perfectly level voice, "then I, of course, cannot stop you. But I will absolutely attach the server data to a formal complaint with the Department of Labor and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and I will show it to the managing director so he understands the true reason for my dismissal." Winters didn't fire her. Moreover, a month later, he requested a transfer to a different division. Being in close proximity to someone who had once cold-bloodedly caught him in a lie in front of the entire staff proved unbearable for him. This incident became a sort of personal manifesto for young Claire. She realized that true power did not lie in screaming or in tears, but in facts, composure, and the absolute readiness to go all the way when the truth is on your side. It was with exactly this character that she approached her meeting with Arthur Drake several years later. Claire's father, Ian Russell, was an old-school structural engineer. He was one of those men who, during the economic shifts of the 90s, didn't chase easy money, but instead partnered with his longtime friend, Vance Drake, to found a modest building materials manufacturing company in the Rust Belt, right outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They started in a leased warehouse on the outskirts of the city with 2 old industrial mixers and a commercial loan that took them nearly a decade to pay off. Ian Russell was in charge of production and engineering technologies. Vance Drake handled sales, distribution, and networking. The company was called Keystone Building Materials, and in its best years, it provided jobs for nearly 300 people. Claire grew up in this atmosphere, surrounded by blueprints, shipping manifests, and dinner table conversations about cement supply chains. Her father had been taking her to the plant since she was 12, showing her how the assembly line worked, explaining the concept of cost of goods sold, and detailing why they could never skimp on quality, even if their competitors were doing exactly that. He was an honest man to the point of rigid principle, and this trait was passed down to his daughter entirely, without a single drop lost. In high school, Claire wasn't a flashy, brilliant student, but she possessed a rare, undeniable stubbornness. If a subject was difficult for her, she would study it until she understood it better than the straight-A students who grasped things on the fly. It was exactly this trait, the ability to methodically, unhurriedly work toward a result, ignoring initial failures, that determined her choice of profession. She enrolled in the university's College of Business to study finance and economics, even though her mother insisted on a softer degree, like communications or psychology. Her father took his daughter's side without a moment's hesitation. "Let her study what she finds interesting," he told her mother then. "A woman with a solid grasp of economics and finance will never have to depend on someone else's opinion of what she is worth." Claire remembered those words, spoken almost casually over a family dinner. For the rest of her life, they would become a sort of unspoken motto for her, long before the day someone would throw words directly in her face designed to destroy that very conviction. When Claire was 23, and the company belonging to her father and Drake had already expanded into a massive regional corporation with several manufacturing plants across the Midwest, a conflict erupted between the partners. The formal reason was mundane, a dispute over profit distribution and development strategy. Ian Russell insisted on modernizing the production lines and investing in new, sustainable technologies. Vance Drake wanted to aggressively force expansion into the Sun Belt by taking on massive high-yield corporate debt. But the true reason, as Claire learned much later, was far more cynical. Drake had forged a series of documents when registering a new subsidiary holding company in Delaware, siphoning off key assets through it. Taking advantage of the fact that he was formally the majority shareholder of the parent management company, he literally forced Ian Russell to sell his shares at a price drastically below market value. He did this under the threat of a long, ruinous, and exhausting legal battle, a battle that her father, honest down to his last penny, was afraid to even initiate. He didn't want to risk the reputation of the enterprise or the livelihoods of the 300 blue-collar workers employed there. Ian Russell signed the buyout papers, walked away from the company he had built with his own two hands over 15 years, and never forgave himself for that decision until the end of his life. He died when Claire was 29. The doctors said his heart gave out, though Claire herself knew the truth. It wasn't physical strain that his heart couldn't handle, but the heavy burden of injustice he had carried inside him for almost 6 years. Just a few months before his death, he had summoned an old acquaintance, a corporate attorney he had been friends with since college, and drafted a document whose existence even Claire was completely unaware of. But more on that later. Claire met Arthur Drake, the son of that very Vance Drake, purely by chance at a mutual friend's birthday party in Philadelphia, 3 years after the falling out between their fathers. She was still going by the name Russell then, working as an analyst at the investment firm and diligently avoiding any mention of her father's corporate past. Arthur turned out to be charming, witty, and possessed that effortless self-confidence typical of people who have never known true hardship. He didn't seem like his father. At least back then, he appeared softer, more attentive, and even somewhat vulnerable. Claire didn't immediately realize whose son he was. When she did find out, she wanted to cut off all contact immediately, but Arthur begged her for a chance. He claimed he didn't share his father's ruthless methods, that he planned to build his own career honestly, from scratch, to prove he was worthy of more than just inheriting someone else's success. "I know what my father did," he told her back then, catching her in the hallway after she had tried to leave one of their dates early. "I've heard his version of the story. And believe me, even in his retelling, it sounds incredibly ugly. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to give a chance to me, a person who has nothing to do with that history except through the accident of birth." "A last name isn't an accident, Arthur," Claire had replied harshly. "It's what you live with every single day. It's what opens doors for you that are slammed shut for others. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your father die because he couldn't survive losing his life's work, which was stolen from him?" Arthur stayed silent for a long time, then longer than she had expected. And when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that sounded like genuine remorse, something she had never heard from anyone in the Drake family before. "No, I don't know what that's like," he said quietly. "But I am willing to listen for as long as it takes, if you'll agree to tell me." He said it so convincingly, with such a spark in his eyes, that Claire, young, and still not fully recovered from the loss of her father, believed him. Perhaps she simply wanted to believe that justice still existed in the world, that the son of the man who ruined her father's legacy was capable of being a different kind of man. They got married a year later. Claire took her husband's last name. At the time, it seemed like a natural gesture of love, not a strategic business decision. She couldn't have imagined that 15 years later, this very last name would become a weapon in the hands of a man who would swear to humiliate her. The first years of their marriage were, to be perfectly honest, happy. Arthur really did try to build his own career. He took a job as a regional sales manager in his father's company, starting almost at the bottom though. Of course, no one dared treat the owner's son like a regular rank-and-file employee. Claire, meanwhile, continued her ascent in the corporate finance sector. And when Vance Drake, aging and increasingly exhausted by the day-to-day operational management of the business, began looking for someone capable of restructuring the corporate holdings' financial strategy, someone on the board of directors suggested his daughter-in-law. Vance Drake, who by that point either barely remembered forcing her father to sell his shares for pennies, or remembered it perfectly well, but felt no need to experience a guilty conscience, agreed. And so, Claire Drake, née Russell, became the chief financial officer of the very company her father had once built. The irony of fate was so bitter that at first, Claire genuinely doubted whether she should accept the C-suite position. But then she decided otherwise. If fate was giving her the opportunity to return to the place from which her father was unjustly exiled, she had no right to refuse, not for the sake of revenge, but for the sake of restoring the justice in which she sincerely believed. She worked like no one else in the company. Over 7 years under her financial stewardship, the holding company, by then rebranded as Drake Group, doubled its revenue, entered new national markets, and completely modernized its production lines, the very modernization her father had once fought for. She implemented a transparent accounting system, eliminated the kickback schemes that had flourished under the old management, and built the company's reputation as a reliable, honest corporate partner. Her first few months in the new role were not easy. The old guard of executives, accustomed to opaque kickback schemes with regional suppliers, viewed the young CFO with suspicion and some with outright hostility. The director of procurement, who had worked at the company for over a decade and had spent years receiving off-the-books bonuses from several vendors in exchange for lucrative contracts, tried to push another shady deal through Claire in her very first week. He figured the young woman, fresh to the role, wouldn't bother digging into the details. Claire dug into the details. After running a forensic analysis on purchasing prices over the last 3 years, she discovered that the company had been systematically overpaying for raw materials by 15% above the market rate. Scaled across the entire holding company, the sum amounted to millions of dollars annually. She called the director of procurement into her office for a one-on-one meeting. "I have 2 options for you," she said calmly, placing the printed comparative pricing analysis on the desk in front of him. "First, you help me build a new, completely transparent bidding system, and we forget about the past. Second, I hand these files over to corporate security and the FBI for wire fraud." And from that point, the further fate of the story was out of her hands. The procurement director chose the first option. A year later, he had become one of the most loyal and effective executives in the new financial bloc. It was a rare case where a man accustomed to playing dirty ultimately preferred playing by the rules when faced with a choice devoid of any illusions. By the time Vance Drake stepped down from the business due to failing health, and formal control passed to Arthur as CEO, the company was essentially resting on Claire's shoulders. Arthur became CEO in name only. Because everyone who had even a slight understanding of the real state of affairs knew that the strategic decisions, the key contracts, the executive hiring policy, all of it was determined by Claire. Arthur signed the papers, acted as the face of the company at industry galas, delivered speeches written for him by PR flacks, and happily accepted congratulations for the company's continuous successes, which were not his doing. Claire wasn't bothered by this. She didn't chase titles. What mattered to her was the work, not the brass nameplate on the office door. This dynamic continued for many years. Over these years, a sort of corporate legend developed around the kind of leader Claire was. Once, a major supplier, leveraging his personal country club connections with Arthur, tried to force the termination of a manufacturing plant floor manager, a blue-collar veteran who had worked at the enterprise for over 20 years. The manager had dared to publicly point out the supplier's systematic delays and poor quality components. The supplier threatened to tear up their contract if the inconvenient manager wasn't fired. Arthur, terrified of losing a massive contract, was already prepared to sign the termination papers. But Claire, upon finding out, immediately scheduled a meeting with both parties. She laid out before the supplier the defect reports, the shipping manifests showing the delays, and the email chains where the floor manager had repeatedly, politely, but firmly pointed out the breaches of contract. "We can terminate our contract with you today if you like," she told the supplier calmly, without a single emotion in her voice. "But we will never fire a man who conscientiously does his job and protects the interests of this company. If you need a yes man willing to turn a blind eye to defective materials for your convenience, look for him somewhere else." The supplier, completely unaccustomed to such pushback, ultimately chose to fix his supply chain rather than lose a highly profitable contract. The floor manager kept his job and worked at the company for many more years. And the story of how the CFO personally stood up to defend a rank-and-file employee against a corporate heavyweight spread across the factory floors almost instantly, solidifying her authority far more effectively than any official corporate mandate. But the more successful the company became, the more Arthur changed. The first alarming bells began ringing about 5 years before that fateful day. Arthur began to get irritated by any work-related critiques, even entirely justified ones. He started comparing himself to his successful frat brothers, complaining that everyone viewed him as a figurehead, even though he was the one formally signing the executive orders. At corporate retreats, he increasingly allowed himself to make jokes at his wife's expense. At first, they were harmless. Then, they grew increasingly caustic. "My wife is our chief of numbers, and I'm the chief of charm," he would say with a smile that grew more forced every time. Claire didn't attach much importance to this at first. She wrote it off as a midlife crisis, the pressure of living in his father's shadow, and the natural fatigue of a long-term marriage. She was patient, but her patience applied to business, to strategy, to knowing when to wait for the right moment. That patience never applied to insults and humiliation. It was just that Arthur hadn't yet crossed the line clearly enough for her to deem a harsh reaction necessary. Gradually, their evenings together, once filled with conversations about their plans, the future, and company business, turned into a series of formal dinners where both increasingly sat in silence, staring at their respective smartphones. Arthur began staying late at the corporate office more often than usual, citing a heavy workload, even though his actual volume of responsibilities, as Claire knew perfectly well, remained exactly the same. He stopped asking for her opinion on issues he used to discuss with her first. And to her rare attempts to have an honest conversation, he reacted with irritation, as if the very discussion of feelings was an infringement on his personal independence. Claire didn't throw tantrums during this period either. Not because she didn't notice what was happening, but because she knew all too well, any pressure would only accelerate the distance between them, and the truth, if it existed, would reveal itself sooner or later. Everything changed when Ashley appeared at the company. Arthur hired Ashley for the position of VP of Communications 3 years ago. She was young, ambitious, strikingly attractive, and possessed an absolute lack of the crisis management experience required for a C-suite position of that level. Claire had spoken out against the appointment at the board of directors meeting, arguing her case with data and examples of failed PR campaigns from the candidate's resume. Arthur insisted on getting his way for the first time in many years, bluntly and harshly forcing the decision through against his wife's expert opinion. The board of directors, not wanting to exacerbate a marital conflict in the boardroom, caved. For the first time, Claire felt that something fundamental was shifting, not in the business, but in their relationship. Arthur seemed determined to prove to himself and everyone around him that he was capable of making decisions independently, contrary to her expertise, contrary to logic, simply because he could. She didn't like it, but she didn't make a scene. She never made a scene. She preferred to act methodically and deal with the substance of the issue. A year and a half later, however, it became abundantly clear that the reason for Arthur's persistence had absolutely nothing to do with professional independence. She found out about the affair not from girlfriends, not from anonymous texts, and not from accidentally seeing his DMs. She found out because she herself, while reviewing the holding company's financial ledgers, noticed strange expenditures on one of the corporate Amex cards, regular, massive charges logged as entertainment and client relations expenses, but unbacked by any actual business meetings. Her professional meticulousness, which for years had helped her root out supplier fraud, this time led her to a much more personal discovery. She didn't throw a scandal. She didn't even tell Arthur that she knew. Instead, she spent several months methodically gathering information. Not because she planned to use it as a weapon in a divorce, but because she was used to doing so. Before making a decision, you must have the complete picture of what is happening. She found out about the leased luxury penthouse in a new downtown high-rise, paid for from the accounts of one of the holding shell subsidiaries under the guise of an executive housing fund. She found out about the trips that were formally logged as business travel but were, in reality, romantic getaways to Napa Valley and the Caribbean. She found out that Ashley had managed to receive 2 unscheduled corporate bonuses in those months, the sum of which exceeded her annual base salary. Claire wasn't a naive idealist who believed in eternal love without a single trial. She understood that marriages fall apart, that feelings fade, that people change. She was prepared for a conversation, for a divorce, even for a painful but honest separation. What she was categorically unprepared to accept was that her husband, who had been cheating on her for a year and a half, was simultaneously humiliating her daily in front of their colleagues, increasingly drunk on the illusory feeling of his own power that, in reality, she had created and maintained through her own grueling work. She made the decision to silently observe the development of events, not forcing a climax. Not because she was afraid, but because her intuition told her the right moment hadn't arrived yet. And, as would become clear later, her intuition didn't fail her. 6 months prior to that fateful day, another event occurred in Claire's life, the significance of which she couldn't fully appreciate at the time. She received a call from Harrison Sterling, an old friend, and the corporate attorney for her late father, the very man Ian Russell had met with shortly before his death. Sterling had managed the Russell family's legal affairs for many years, but lately, they had barely spoken. Except for formal occasions related to the estate. "Claire," he said over the phone, his voice sounding unusually grave. "We need to meet. There are documents your father asked me to hand over to you, under specific circumstances. I believe those circumstances are now arriving." Claire didn't attach much importance to the call at the time, writing it off as some legal formality, perhaps related to a trust set up long ago. She was too busy preparing the holding's annual SEC filings, too consumed with watching the drama of her own marriage unfold, to dive into the details. She agreed to the meeting but rescheduled it twice due to urgent business matters. The third time, Sterling insisted, saying a phrase Claire would remember for a long time. "Claire, trust my experience. What I have to show you is far more important than any quarterly report." Your father foresaw this moment long before it arrived. He was a wise man, and he knew how the story Vance Drake started all those years ago would end. These words seemed strange to Claire, almost mystical. It wasn't in her nature to believe in such cryptic significance, but she agreed to a meeting scheduled for 2 weeks later. A lot happened in those 2 weeks. The atmosphere at the corporate headquarters was heating up. Arthur, having completely lost all sense of proportion in his arrogance, began making decisions that directly contradicted the financial strategy Claire had built over the years. He pushed for a massive M&A deal, a merger with a regional rival. The economic viability of the deal was, to put it mildly, highly questionable, but it promised him a significant expansion of his personal executive power and, as it was later discovered, hefty consulting fees channeled through a third-party intermediary structure where, surprisingly, the hidden beneficial owner was none other than Ashley. At the board of directors meeting, Claire explicitly pointed out the risks of this acquisition. She presented a detailed financial model proving the holding company would suffer massive midterm losses. Arthur, instead of listening to reason, took this as a personal attack on his authority. During the session, in front of the other board members, he allowed himself a phrase that silenced the entire room. Maybe it's time to remind some people who actually makes the final decisions around here. I am tired of having to clear my every word with the accounting department. Claire didn't answer him then. She silently closed her folder of spreadsheets, nodded to the attendees, and walked out of the boardroom. Later that night, at home, she allowed herself for the first time in years to take an honest look at the situation. A marriage that had long turned into a formality, a partnership her husband no longer valued, a company she had dragged out of the ruins. Only to now watch her own spouse methodically drag it back into the abyss, all for the sake of his vanity and for a woman whose salary she was essentially paying with her own labor. She didn't cry. She never cried over such things. Instead, she took out the leather-bound notebook where she had kept personal notes for years, not a diary in the traditional sense, but rather a chronicle of executive decisions. And she wrote a single line: "Time to reallocate priorities." The next day, she called Sterling and asked to meet as soon as possible. The meeting took place in his modest, old-fashioned law office in downtown Pittsburgh, which smelled of old paper, fresh coffee, and mahogany bookcases packed with legal statutes dating back decades. Sterling, a short, lean man in his 70s with the piercing gaze of someone who had seen dozens of corporate trials, pulled a thick manila envelope, tied with a string, out of his safe. It was old-fashioned, almost theatrical, but Claire knew this man was never prone to theatrics without reason. "Your father," he began, carefully laying the documents out on his desk, "was not only an honest man, but a remarkably forward-thinking one. When Vance Drake forced him to sell his stake in the company, Ian didn't just accept it. Anticipating the pressure, he had already funneled a series of investments through an independent blind trust, an entity whose existence was completely unknown to anyone, including, by the way, your husband." Claire listened intently, not yet understanding where the lawyer was leading. "Your father, having sold his shares in Keystone Building Materials at a depressed price, invested the proceeds, modest by those standards, but over time, growing exponentially into a hedge fund specializing in acquiring equity in promising regional assets. The fund was managed by a man Ian trusted implicitly, me, to be precise. Operating through a partner legal LLC. The fund acted with extreme caution, quietly growing its portfolio for years, reinvesting profits, staying entirely in the shadows. And 2 years ago, Claire, this fund, the very one for which you are the sole ultimate beneficial owner, according to your father's will and all supporting legal documents, began quietly buying up shares of the parent holding company that controls Drake Group." Claire felt her breath catch, but outwardly, she remained absolutely stoic. Years of working with SEC filings and financial audits had taught her never to show emotion prematurely, not until she had fully grasped the consequences of what she was hearing. The acquisitions were conducted entirely legally through open trading on the OTC markets and by buying out minority shareholders, some of whom, by the way, were quite eager to sell their stakes, being dissatisfied with the management decisions of the past few years. Sterling continued. "As of today, the fund of which you are the beneficiary has consolidated 47% of the parent company's stock. Another 6% was sold just last week by one of the legacy shareholders whose name I cannot disclose just yet due to NDAs, but I assure you, the transaction is fully closed and legally bulletproof. This means, Claire, that as of today, the controlling interest in the parent corporate structure and consequently, the actual, absolute control over Drake Group belongs to you." Silence hung in the office. Claire stared at the documents in front of her. Registry printouts, stock purchase agreements, notarized copies, bank wire confirmations. She felt how, inside her, a completely new picture of reality was slowly but inevitably taking shape. "Why didn't my father tell me about this while he was alive?" she asked quietly. Sterling sighed, took off his glasses, and wiped them with a handkerchief, a gesture she remembered from childhood when he would come to their house to discuss business with her dad. "He was afraid, Claire. Not for himself, but for you. He saw how genuinely you fell in love with Arthur, saw that you were happy in those early years, and he didn't want knowledge of this fund to influence your choices in any way. He didn't want it to make you think you married for a potential payout, or, conversely, force you to destroy your marriage prematurely out of a sense of revenge for him. He believed that if the truth ever surfaced, and he had no doubt that sooner or later, it would surface at the right moment. At a time when you, through your own hard work and character, had proven that you were worthy of taking back what was unjustly stolen from your family. He left a strict directive: activate your executive control of the fund only when you personally came to me and confirmed you were ready. Until that moment, the trust was to operate autonomously, accumulating assets, but never directly interfering in the company's operational management. And if I had never come to you? Claire asked softly. If I had lived with Arthur my whole life without ever knowing the truth? Sterling thought for a moment before answering. Then the fund would have simply continued to grow in the shadows, biding its time, and upon your passing, it would have transferred to your heirs with the exact same instructions. Your father wasn't banking on a specific scenario, Claire. He was banking on your character. He believed that sooner or later, you would either want to uncover the true state of affairs yourself, or life would force you to take that step. He was wrong about only one thing: he didn't think it would happen under such unfortunately unpleasant circumstances. Claire remained silent for a long time, staring at the paperwork. For 15 years, she had sincerely believed she was building the company's success for the sake of the work, for the sake of justice, for the memory of her father, never suspecting that all this time, invisibly, parallel to her own efforts, another mechanism was at work. A mechanism her father had set in motion long before her marriage, long before her Wall Street career, as if foreseeing that one day his daughter would need not only a moral weapon, but a highly material, legally weaponized one. What do I need to do to officially assume operational control of the fund? She finally asked, her voice steady and businesslike. Exactly as it always sounded when she made decisions that changed everything. Sign a few documents, Sterling replied, and decide exactly when you want the information regarding the new shareholder structure to become public knowledge and, specifically, when you want the Drake Group Executive Board to know. Formally, by the way, up until the moment of official disclosure to the SEC and the corporation itself, you can act anonymously through the fund's proxy representatives, should you wish to maintain confidentiality for a while longer. Claire gave him a long look, in which, for the first time in years, something resembling the cold, calculating calm of a hunter, finally seeing her prey, appeared. I will sign the documents today, she said. But I want to delay the disclosure indefinitely. I need everything to look as though nothing has changed, until it changes permanently. Sterling smiled slightly, for the first time during the meeting. Your father always said you inherited not only his principles, but his patience. Now I see, he was absolutely right. She signed the documents, every page calmly, thoughtfully, without rushing. Though inside her a total storm of emotions was raging, she did not yet allow it to break the surface. She knew that now she possessed not just a moral right, but a real, legally flawless instrument. But it had to be used with a cool head, at the perfect moment, not in the heat of passion. Leaving Sterling's office that evening, Claire didn't yet know that the perfect moment would arrive in exactly 2 weeks, and that the catalyst for the climax would not be calculation, but another humiliation, one that Arthur, blinded by his own arrogance, would consider a harmless joke before filing for divorce. He would make a catastrophic mistake and pay a higher price for it than he could ever imagine. The 2 weeks following the meeting with Sterling were harder on Claire than she had anticipated. Not because she doubted the righteousness of her decision, there wasn't an ounce of doubt, but because, for the first time in her life, she had to play a double game, and that contradicted her entire nature. She was used to acting openly, justifiably, looking her opponent straight in the eye. Now, every morning she came into the corporate headquarters, sat across from her husband at board meetings, discussed quarterly metrics, listened to his arrogant monologues, and knew something he didn't. She knew that formally, according to the documents locked in Sterling's safe, real power over the corporation, he considered his personal fiefdom already belonged to her. She bided her time. Showing her cards prematurely would mean losing the advantage of surprise. And surprise, as her father had taught her, was the most valuable resource in any battle, be it business or war. Furthermore, she understood that Arthur had to push the situation to the brink with his own hands to the exact point after which she would have not just a moral, but an absolutely indisputable legal justification to act ruthlessly. She knew corporate law too well to strike wildly without solid legal backing, and Arthur, blinded by hubris, was bringing that moment closer every single day. The first red flag was when Arthur stopped hiding his relationship with Ashley. Previously, he had at least maintained the illusion of propriety. He didn't appear with her at public events, didn't flaunt their joint trips. Now, it was as if he decided there was no longer any need to hide. At a corporate gala celebrating the company's anniversary, he ostentatiously spent the entire evening by Ashley's side, introducing her to partners as the new strategic voice of the company, even though her PR title implied no such status. Claire stood on the other side of the ballroom, chatting with a major steel supplier, watching the scene out of the corner of her eye. Several employees threw sympathetic but cautious glances in her direction. Everyone had understood everything for a long time, but no one dared say it out loud. She endured the entire evening with perfect posture and a professional smile plastered on her face. Only one person. Paige, her executive assistant, who had been with her for 6 years and knew her well enough to read between the lines. Noticed how tightly Claire gripped her sparkling water the entire time her husband flaunted his affair in front of 50 business partners. "Claire, maybe you should head home early?" Paige asked quietly, approaching her between toasts. "No," Claire answered calmly. "I am going to watch this play out, to the very end. I need to see exactly how far he is willing to go." Paige didn't press for details. She had long ago learned to trust her boss's judgment, even when she didn't fully understand the logic. Later that evening, Andrew Crawford, the oldest member of the board of directors and an industry veteran who had been friends with her father, approached Claire. He stood quietly beside her, looking exactly where she was looking. At Arthur and Ashley, chatting animatedly surrounded by investors. "Claire," he said in a low voice. "I am too old to pretend I don't see the obvious. I want you to know, if one day you need the support of the board of directors, you will have it. Many of us remember who has actually been keeping this company afloat for the past few years, and we don't intend to turn a blind eye to this forever." "Thank you, Andrew," Claire replied in a level tone. "But I am not in the habit of asking for support before there is a tangible need for it." "I know." Crawford chuckled. "Your father was exactly the same way. Sometimes I think patience is inherited by children far more often than money." Claire said nothing, only giving a brief nod. But she remembered those words, just as she remembered the feeling that in this standoff, she was nowhere near as alone as it might have seemed from the outside. A few days after the gala, Arthur called Claire into his corner office, formally to discuss the Q3 financials, but the conversation quickly veered in a completely different direction. "We need to talk about our marriage," he said, without preamble. Leaning back in his leather executive chair with the look of a man who had already made his decision and had no intention of debating it. "I think you've understood everything for a while now. We are just too different. I want a divorce." Claire looked at him carefully, studying his face. She searched for even a hint of regret, of awkwardness, of basic human guilt. She found nothing but poorly concealed relief, as if he had rehearsed this line for months and finally gathered the courage to say it. "All right," she replied evenly. "I have no intention of keeping you. If you think this is the right move, let's get a divorce." Her absolute calm clearly caught Arthur off guard. He had apparently expected tears, accusations, a highly emotional scene for which he had prepared a list of counterarguments. Instead, he received a cold, businesslike acknowledgement of a fact, and this threw him off balance. You don't have anything else to say?" he asked, frowning. "What is there to say, Arthur? You've been sleeping with Ashley for a year and a half, paying for a luxury high-rise out of a dummy corporate entertainment fund from one of the Shell subsidiaries. You authorized 2 illegal, off-the-books bonuses for her using the company's budget. I found out about this 8 months ago. It would be rather strange of me to fake surprise or despair right now." Arthur turned pale. He clearly had not anticipated that she was aware of all the details, especially the financial ones, the kind that could become a massive liability if someone decided to leak them to the IRS or the board of directors. That has nothing to do with this," he muttered, trying to regain his footing. "I am talking about a divorce, not a corporate audit." Naturally, Claire nodded. "I just wanted you to understand, I see things exactly as they are. I always have. I just didn't feel the need to manufacture drama prematurely." She stood up and headed for the door, but right at the threshold, she turned back. "Since we are speaking frankly, Arthur, I want you to know one thing. Whatever you are planning next regarding the divorce, regarding the company, I am not going to stay quiet and tolerate injustice just because I used to love you. That is in the past. From now on, I will operate based strictly on facts and the law. Keep that in mind." She walked out without waiting for a reply. Arthur was left sitting at his desk, feeling a strange, inexplicable wave of anxiety. It was as if she knew something else, something beyond the affair with Ashley, something he couldn't quite figure out yet. Preparing for the divorce proceedings, Claire hired a separate family law attorney, intentionally not Sterling, so as to completely separate the legal division of marital assets from the matters regarding her father's trust, the existence of which her divorce lawyer didn't even suspect. At their first meeting, she outlined her position with absolute clarity. "I am not going to demand a single cent above what I am entitled to by law," she said then. "But I have no intention of conceding anything that is rightfully mine, either. The division of assets must happen strictly according to Pennsylvania equitable distribution statutes, down the middle, with no sentimental gestures in anyone's direction." Some clients in similar situations, especially when adultery is involved, push for more favorable asset division by leveraging the moral high ground, the attorney noted. "Morals and the law are two different categories," Claire replied. "I want it so that after the divorce, no one, including Arthur, can accuse me of using emotions as leverage. I don't need an extra square foot of real estate. I need the flawless reputation of someone who plays fair, even when they have every moral right to do otherwise." The lawyer, who had seen dozens of clients act out of spite or vengeance in his practice, noted this client as a rare exception, a person capable of entirely separating justice from emotion, even in the most painful of life situations. The divorce, officially initiated a few days later, went through quickly and without major complications on paper. The marriage was childless, and the marital assets, as Claire's divorce lawyer explained, held separately from Sterling to avoid any conflict of interest, proved much simpler to untangle than anticipated. The jointly acquired property over the years of marriage consisted of the downtown condo, a country house, and several luxury cars. All of this was divided equally, according to state property laws. However, Claire's personal wealth, nested inside the hedge fund long before the marriage, the very fund built on the money her father salvaged from selling his corporate shares before she even wed. Arthur was legally considered premarital, Kundran and Ashen, separate property. It was completely exempt from distribution. Neither Arthur nor his high-priced legal team preparing the divorce papers even suspected the existence of this trust. The entire structure was nested through proxy holders and independent fiduciaries, legally pristine, but so heavily shielded from public records that it hadn't appeared on a single joint tax return or asset declaration in over a decade. Signing the divorce settlement, Claire felt a strange, almost detached tranquility. She was giving up half the condo, half the house, one of the cars, and felt absolutely zero regret. Material possessions were never her primary value. Arthur, however, tried to play the guilt card at the very last moment, whether out of residual conscience or a desire to test her resolve one final time. "Maybe we rushed this?" he said one afternoon, as they both sat in the mediator's office, signing the final decrees. 15 years together is no joke. We could have tried to maintain at least the appearance of a family for the sake of the company's reputation, for our shared business. Claire looked at him intently, without malice, but also without a shadow of a doubt. "Arthur, you are asking me to maintain the illusion of a family for the sake of a company that you yourself nearly destroyed with your decisions over the last few months. I am done living for the appearance of anything, not a family, not a marriage, and certainly not your peace of mind. If you want to salvage something, start by showing some respect to the people who work next to you. That no longer applies to me, but maybe it will be useful to you in the future." She signed the last document and walked out of the mediator's office without waiting for a reply. Just as she exited any conversation where there was nothing left to say, what mattered far more was what was happening simultaneously in the shadows of this formal process. While the divorce lawyers ironed out the real estate details, Sterling was finalizing the last legal maneuvers to officially consolidate the controlling shares of the holding company in Claire's name. The divorce was finalized relatively quickly. But the working relationship at the office didn't get any easier. In fact, it grew even more tense. Arthur, freed from his formal marital obligations, apparently felt completely unrestrained in his actions toward his ex-wife. He now viewed her strictly as a subordinate whose presence in the company was an uncomfortable reminder of the past, rather than a highly valuable executive asset. He began methodically, though initially cautiously, stripping her of her corporate authority. First, he revoked her sole signatory rights on specific financial instruments, transferring that power to a new VP of Finance he hired without consulting her. Then, he started inviting Ashley to the high-level C-suite strategy meetings. Having promoted her to Chief Strategy Officer, a position that hadn't even existed in the corporate hierarchy and was created specifically for her. Completely bypassing standard HR vetting procedures. Claire observed these maneuvers with cold, analytical calm, documenting every violation, every deviation from corporate bylaws, every abuse of power. She understood that Arthur, blinded by his desire to prove his executive prowess to himself and to Ashley, would sooner or later make a mistake so egregious that even the board of directors who had thus far remained neutral wouldn't be able to ignore it. She was proven right faster than she had anticipated. Arthur's fatal mistake was the M&A deal with the regional competitor, the very acquisition Claire had vehemently opposed months earlier, long before the divorce. After the divorce, Arthur, having lost the last restraining factor of his wife's input, bulldozed the deal through the board almost single-handedly, leveraging his administrative power and calling in favors from board members who owed their seats to his father. The deal closed. And barely 2 months later, exactly what Claire had warned about came to light. The acquired company was drowning in hidden liabilities. The legal due diligence which Arthur had outsourced, not to one of the independent Big Four auditing firms, but to a boutique, shady law firm closely tied to the intermediary LLC, where Ashley was the hidden beneficiary, had conveniently failed to flag these debts. The total amount of hidden obligations that surfaced post-merger was nearly $3 million. The board of directors called an emergency session. The atmosphere was tighter than it had been in the entire history of the company. For the first time in years, direct questions were asked regarding Arthur's competence as CEO, his ability to make calculated strategic decisions without the oversight of the financial department. At this meeting, Claire presented an exhaustive post-mortem of the disaster. She delivered it dryly, based strictly on facts, without a single hint of personal gloating, even though internally, she knew she had foreseen this exact moment long ago. She laid out the timeline of events, highlighted the blatant violations of due diligence protocols, provided the projected loss calculations, and offered scenarios for mitigating the damage. The board listened to her with rapt attention, some were even taking furious notes. One of the board members, representing minority institutional investors, point-blank asked Arthur why the vendor due diligence was handed to a boutique law firm with zero M&A experience in their sector, instead of one of the reputable consulting firms the holding company normally used. I felt it was necessary to trust verified partners, Arthur attempted to explain, clearly unwilling to name the true reason for selecting that specific firm. Verified by whom? The same board member pressed. To my knowledge, this firm has never executed a single major corporate due diligence project in our industry. Arthur couldn't find an answer and opted to change the subject, citing the need to move to the next item on the agenda. But that brief exchange did not go unnoticed. Several board members exchanged glances, and Claire clearly saw in their eyes the budding seeds of distrust that would inevitably blossom into something much larger. After the meeting, Andrew Crawford, the industry veteran who had known her father, pulled her aside. "Claire," he said quietly, "I'll speak plainly. Many of us have known for a long time who really holds this ship together. The board's patience is not infinite. If Arthur continues making decisions in this vein, the question of his continued tenure as CEO will be put to a vote, and quite soon." Claire thanked him for his candor but declined to elaborate on the situation. She knew Arthur's fate as the head of the company was already sealed. It was just that no one knew it yet, except for her and a very tight circle of insiders. Arthur, however, perceived the fallout completely differently. Instead of owning up to his failures and trying to rebuild the board's trust by cooperating with the finance department, he chose the exact opposite strategy, finding a scapegoat. Naturally, he appointed Claire as the chief culprit for all his problems. His logic, as Claire pieced together from snippets of office gossip passed along by loyal employees, boiled down to this: as long as she held the CFO title and influenced the board, she was actively undermining his authority, turning the directors against him, and cultivating an atmosphere of distrust around his leadership. Remove her from the company, and the board would magically return to offering him their unconditional support as the sole legitimate heir to the corporate throne. It was utterly irrational logic, born of a bruised ego and a refusal to acknowledge his own incompetence. But this logic, it seemed, had firmly taken root in Arthur's mind by that point. He began preparing the ground to fire her. Finding a legal pretense to terminate a C-level executive, especially one with Claire's level of competence and track record, was no easy task. Labor laws and corporate bylaws heavily protected executives from arbitrary termination, and any violation of procedure threatened massive wrongful termination lawsuits. Arthur, consulting with that same shady boutique law firm that had botched the M&A deal, decided to execute a corporate restructuring. Under the guise of optimizing the financial division, they planned to eliminate the position of Chief Financial Officer entirely, replacing it with several narrower VP roles, none of which, naturally, would be offered to Claire. Formally, this fell under a standard corporate reduction in force. If all protocols were followed, a 60-day Warren Act notice, offering alternative lateral positions, paying out a golden parachute severance, it was a perfectly legal way to fire someone. The problem was that Arthur, rushing to finish the job, clearly intended to violate at least half of those procedures, banking on the assumption that his ex-wife wouldn't sue the company out of concern for her own reputation or a desire to avoid a public scandal. During one of the prep meetings with the shady lawyers handling Arthur's dirty work, a conversation took place that would later be reconstructed from the testimony of one of the participants. A junior associate drafting the termination papers cautiously pointed out that a C-suite elimination required 60 days' notice and a mandatory offer of available vacancies, including a currently open senior VP of accounting role. "I don't care about vacancies," Arthur had snapped. "I need her out of the building as quickly and as publicly as possible. Find whatever legal phrasing you need to cut the timeline to zero." "Mr. Drake," the associate tried to object, "if we take that approach, the termination can be challenged in court within a month, and the corporation will face massive penalties for wrongful dismissal and back pay. Then the company takes the hit," Arthur barked. "I'm not scared of that. Let them try to sue. By the time a judge even looks at the docket, everyone will already know who the boss of this company is." The young lawyer stayed quiet, though internally he was certain this kind of hubris would spectacularly backfire. He couldn't have known just how much that hubris would cost his client in the very near future. Paige, having accidentally overheard a snippet of Arthur's phone call with the lawyers where the word termination was used in conjunction with Claire, immediately warned her, even though she risked her own career by leaking the information. "Claire," Paige said in a tense whisper, walking into her office and shutting the heavy door tightly, "I think you need to know. Arthur is preparing the paperwork to fire you, under the guise of a corporate restructuring." Claire listened calmly, nodded, thanked her for her vigilance, but her face betrayed absolutely zero anxiety. Inside, however, she felt a strange, almost ironic sense of relief. Arthur was finally taking the exact step she had subconsciously been waiting for all these weeks. The step that would finally and irreversibly free her from any lingering doubts or hesitation. She dialed Sterling's number that very evening. "Harrison," she said when the lawyer picked up. "I think the time has come. I need you to prepare all the SEC filings and board disclosures regarding the ownership structure. I need it ready within the week." "He decided to move forward with the termination?" Sterling asked. His voice carried a mix of concern for her and the deep professional satisfaction of a man who had waited years for this exact moment. "Yes," Claire replied. "And it seems he plans to do it as humiliatingly as possible. Let him do it. I want him to go exactly as far as his ego will carry him. I need absolute clarity on his intentions before I respond." The next few days were spent in preparation. Sterling and his legal team finalized all the SEC Form 13D filings required to officially notify the federal regulators and the board of directors about the change in majority ownership of the parent company. Simultaneously, a packet of documents was prepped to call an emergency, extraordinary shareholder meeting, the very meeting where Claire now understood the fate of not just her career, but the entire company would be decided for years to come. Claire continued performing her duties as if nothing was happening, auditing ledgers, approving budgets, meeting with partners. She acted so naturally that even the most perceptive executives didn't notice the slightest hint of the approaching storm in her demeanor. Only Paige, who knew her too well, could feel it. Beneath this external calm lay something massive, something just about to detonate. 2 days before the planned firing, Arthur summoned the board secretary and ordered her to draft the formal termination notice for the chief financial officer due to elimination of position. He signed the document in advance, intending to hand it to her personally, theatrically, putting a definitive end to their years-long standoff in front of as many witnesses as possible. He wanted humiliation. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted the entire C-suite to watch as the woman he had once loved, and then grown to hate because she proved stronger and more competent than he was, walked out of the building with her head bowed. He had no idea how catastrophically he was miscalculating reality. Claire knew about the impending firing in advance, not just because of Paige, but through her own network of loyalists within the company she had spent 15 years building. She knew the exact date and the approximate time. And by the time Arthur was preparing to hand her the termination papers, all the documents necessary to turn his arrogance into total ruin were sitting on Sterling's desk, ready for immediate deployment. She came into the office that day, as usual, calm, collected, impeccably dressed in a dark graphite-tailored suit that always gave her a sense of total control over any situation. She didn't know exactly when Arthur would decide to play out his little drama, but she was ready for any scenario. She took the elevator to the executive floor, greeted the staff, walked into her office, and arranged the files on her desk. A standard morning ritual that masked the absolute internal calm of a person who knew. Today, one chapter of her life ends, and a completely different one begins. The one for which her father, 15 years ago, before even knowing Arthur Drake existed in his daughter's life, had laid the foundation, a foundation even she hadn't known about until recently. She was sitting at her desk reviewing morning emails when her office door swung open without a knock. Arthur strode into the office with a decisive, almost theatrical gait, as if he had rehearsed this scene in front of a mirror, imagining how incredibly powerful he would look. He held a legal folder in his hand, and his face wore that familiar smirk Claire had learned to spot from a mile away, a mix of vanity and poorly concealed insecurity that he always tried to mask with aggressive posturing. Behind him, lingering near the doorway, stood Ashley. She was clearly invited specifically to bear witness to the triumph Arthur had been planning for months. In the hallway, outside the half-open door, Claire noticed several other employees who had accidentally found themselves nearby, clearly sensing that something major was going down. Corporate environments have a way of picking up on brewing conflict before a single word is spoken. "I have some news for you," Arthur announced, walking up to her desk and tossing the folder down with such aggressive carelessness that a few pages slid out across the glass tabletop. "The board of directors approved the restructuring of the financial block. Your position no longer exists. As of today, you are fired." Claire looked down at the document silently. It was a termination notice disguised as a corporate downsizing, drafted exactly as she had predicted: glaring violations of WARN Act protocol, zero offer of lateral transfer. Ignoring vacancies she knew for a fact existed in the HR ledger that morning. The legal breaches were so obvious that, if she wanted to, she could have tied the company up in litigation for months, won a wrongful termination suit, and forced a reinstatement with full back pay. But she already knew she wouldn't need to take that path. She had a weapon, infinitely more powerful. "Why are you so quiet?" Arthur continued, raising his voice, clearly irritated by her composure. Her silence was robbing his scene of the dramatic climax he had anticipated. "Did you think you were going to cling to this company forever, hiding behind the fact that you used to be my wife? Well, here is a news flash for you. You were never anyone here except my wife. Without my last name, without my status, you are nothing. You are just a regular hired employee who can be fired with the stroke of a pen. So sign the paperwork and get the hell out of my building. Without my last name, you are nothing." He said it loudly, almost with sadistic pleasure, clearly hoping that this phrase would be a devastating blow, the final argument that would crush her self-worth and send her running from the building in tears. Humiliated and broken. Silence fell over the office. Ashley smirked slightly by the door. Someone in the hallway held their breath. "You have nothing to say?" Arthur repeated, growing increasingly aggravated by her silence. "You're not even going to try to argue? You're not going to beg me to reconsider? Why would I?" Claire asked, looking him dead in the eye for the first time during the entire exchange. "You've already made your decision. You didn't come in here for a dialogue, Arthur. You came in here for a show. You came to feel strong at the expense of someone else's humiliation. Well, I have no intention of denying you that today. Consider your goal achieved." She picked up her Mont Blanc pen, smoothly signed the bottom of the HR document without a single tremor in her hand, without a single hesitation, and placed the pen back on the desk. "Fine," she said quietly but firmly. "Since you insist." She stood up, picked up her designer tote bag, and intentionally left several personal items untouched on her desk: a framed photograph of her father in plain wood, her leather planner, and a coffee mug with the logo of a STEM charity she supported. She left them on purpose, knowing perfectly well she wouldn't have to sneak back in to collect them like a fugitive. She would walk past this desk again, but in an entirely different capacity. She walked toward the door, passing Arthur without gracing him with another word, and gave Ashley a perfectly neutral, almost polite nod, a gesture that apparently unnerved the PR director, far more than any angry tirade would have. Claire stepped out into the hallway, where about 10 employees were pretending to look at their phones, and walked away. Arthur was left standing in the middle of her office, feeling a strange, highly unpleasant sense of dissatisfaction. He had wanted tears, begging, a screaming match. Instead, he got a quiet, dignified silence that somehow felt far more terrifying than any hysterical meltdown. Claire walked down the hall with a calm, measured stride, took the elevator to the lobby, walked out into the Pittsburgh air, got into her SUV, and only then behind tinted windows, far from prying eyes, did she allow herself a few seconds of absolute, unrestrained silence. She didn't cry. She wasn't shaking with rage. She simply sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling one door permanently slam shut and another swing wide open. She pulled out her phone and dialed Sterling. "Harrison," she said evenly. "I signed the papers. He officially fired me. The pretense is a corporate restructuring with massive procedural violations. Violations I could easily use against him in a labor dispute, obviously. But I won't. We have a much more reliable instrument." "Understood, Claire," Sterling replied, and in his voice was the unmistakable hum of barely contained satisfaction. "Then the time has officially arrived. The SEC disclosures have been finalized since this morning. I am transmitting the formal notifications to the regulatory bodies and simultaneously to the Drake Group Board of Directors within the hour. I am also initiating the call for an emergency extraordinary shareholder meeting for the parent C Corp. Under Delaware law, as the majority shareholder, you have every right to convene this on an expedited timeline to vote on the removal of the subsidiary's CEO. Do it," Claire said shortly. "Let the chips fall where they may." She kept him on the line for a moment longer to address one crucial detail. "Harrison, one more thing. I want the language regarding Arthur's temporary suspension drafted as cautiously as possible. No emotional adjectives, no phrasing that could be construed as public defamation prior to a forensic audit. I refuse to give him grounds for a countersuit regarding slander or corporate defamation. I want it cold, dry, and legally bulletproof." "Naturally, Claire," Sterling responded with deep respect. "That is exactly how my team drafted it. Caution and precision, that's what I taught your father back when we were drafting the very first contracts for Keystone. It is a pleasure to see the lesson wasn't lost." Meanwhile, back at the Drake Group headquarters, something Arthur could never have anticipated was unfolding. Roughly 40 minutes after Claire left the building, the executive suite where Arthur was still lingering with Ashley, discussing the triumphant scene he had just orchestrated, received an urgent, encrypted legal document via email, flagged for immediate review by the CEO and the board of directors. The board secretary, Victoria, a young woman who hadn't been with the company long but had earned a reputation for being sharp and highly competent, opened the attachment. As she read it, her throat went completely dry. The document was an official legal notification filed on behalf of a Delaware-based blind trust with an unpronounceable name, announcing the completion of a consolidation event. The trust now held the controlling stake of the parent holding company that owned 100% of Drake Group. Attached to the notification was an SEC Schedule 13D filing confirming that the fund, and consequently, its sole ultimate beneficial owner now controlled 53% of the parent company's voting shares. And there, in black and white, was the name of that beneficial owner. Claire Russell. Victoria read the document 3 times, trying to convince herself she had made a mistake, that it was a typo, or some elaborate phishing scam. But the filings were impeccably official, complete with digital watermarks, SEC routing numbers, and notarized affidavits. Moreover, exactly 1 minute later, her desk phone rang. It was Harrison Sterling's corporate law firm, officially introducing themselves as the legal representatives of the new majority shareholder. Demanding immediate access to the corporate governance portal to update the shareholder registry and prep the notices for an emergency board meeting. Victoria stood up from her desk, her hands physically shaking, and walked toward the CEO's office. She knocked, but without waiting for a reply, pushed the door open. The situation was too critical to stand on ceremony. Arthur and Ashley were standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, still relishing their victory. Seeing the secretary's pale face, Arthur scowled. "What is it?" "Victoria." "I asked not to be disturbed." "Mr. Drake," she said, her voice trembling. Have you heard about the new owner of the company?" Arthur blinked in sheer confusion. "What are you talking about?" "My family owns this company. What new owner?" Victoria silently handed him the printed legal filings, because she literally couldn't find the words. Arthur snatched the papers, scanned the first line, then the second, the third. And gradually, his face began to morph. The arrogant mask dissolved, replaced by a frozen grimace of absolute shock. "This is impossible," he muttered, flipping frantically through the pages as if hoping to find a punchline, proof of a prank, or a massive clerical error. "There's a mistake here. Russell, that's..." He trailed off. If Claire could have seen his face in that moment, she would have instantly recognized it. The look a man gets when the entire architecture of his arrogant reality, built on a foundation of lies, collapses in real time. "That's my ex-wife's maiden name," he whispered, speaking more to himself than anyone else in the room. Over the next hour, events began to unfold with the ruthless speed that only a flawless, well-oiled legal machine built in the shadows over many years can generate. Sterling, acting strictly within Delaware corporate law and corporate bylaws, officially notified every member of the board of directors about the change in majority ownership and the convening of an emergency shareholder meeting on the fastest legally permissible timeline. Simultaneously, the inboxes of every C-suite executive at Drake Group pinged with an official mandate from the new majority shareholder. It announced the immediate, temporary suspension of the current chief executive officer, pending a forensic corporate audit. The suspension cited credible suspicion of financial malpractice, stemming from the recent regional M&A acquisition, as well as evidence of misappropriation of corporate funds through fictitious entertainment budgets. Naturally, this phrasing, meticulously sanitized by Sterling's team, was 100% legal and strictly adhered to corporate bylaws, which granted a majority shareholder the right to suspend an executive officer pending an emergency board vote if credible financial threats were identified. Along with the email, every board member received a personal phone call from Sterling's partners, explaining the situation and formally inviting them to the emergency vote. Andrew Crawford, receiving the call, didn't show an ounce of surprise. "Finally," he said curtly, "tell Claire I will be at the meeting, and she has my full backing on whatever rational resolution she proposes." The other board member, the one who had grilled Arthur about the shady boutique law firm, reacted more reservedly, but no less definitively. "I've been waiting for someone to clean house around here. If it took this many years of patience to do it, then the result is all the more valuable." Only one board member, a man with deep personal ties to the Drake family, reacted with hesitation, asking for time to review the filings before taking a stance. But even he didn't sound willing to openly contest the legality of the takeover. The SEC filings were far too bulletproof. Arthur, reading the suspension notice on his monitor, felt the floor literally drop out from under him. That morning, he was the all-powerful CEO, capable of firing a 15-year veteran with a stroke of a pen. Now, he was the one locked out of the system. Temporarily, formally, but absolutely genuinely suspended. And suspended by the very person he had publicly humiliated just hours earlier, confident in his own total impunity. "How is this possible?" he asked Ashley. Who, to her credit, displayed far more survival instinct in this situation than Arthur did. She was already slowly backing toward the door, instinctively realizing that standing next to a man whose career was detonating in real time was a terrible PR move for her own future. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But Arthur, I think you need to call your lawyers. Immediately. The real ones, not the guys who handled the merger." She said this while standing on the threshold, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Ashley, having mentally calculated her own legal exposure regarding those off-the-books bonuses, realized that her corporate windfall had suddenly mutated into a potential felony indictment. She walked out of the office without looking back and dialed her own independent defense attorney from the hallway. Meanwhile, Claire, having arrived back at her house, received a debrief from Sterling on the chaos unfolding at headquarters. She listened calmly, occasionally asking clarifying questions not out of vindictiveness, but out of her professional habit of controlling every metric of a project. The board secretary reported that Arthur is in a state bordering on total panic, Sterling noted. He has already tried calling his father multiple times, but Vance, as I understand it, is currently undergoing stroke rehabilitation at a clinic in Boca Raton and is physically incapable of intervening, even if he wanted to. Arthur also tried calling several board members, but most of them have already received our filings and are taking a wait-and-see approach until the vote. When is the emergency meeting scheduled? Claire asked. 5 days from today. The minimum statutory requirement for an extraordinary summons in Delaware. Enough time to fulfill all procedural mandates and eliminate any grounds for him to file an injunction. Claire went silent for a moment, looking out her window at the Pennsylvania twilight. "Good," she finally said. 5 days. In the meantime, please prepare the complete dossier for the board to review regarding the change in executive leadership. I need a flawless legal foundation that leaves zero room for litigation down the line. I want everything done perfectly by the book. Not because Arthur deserves leniency, but because I refuse to give him a single procedural loophole to weaponize against me." "Absolutely, Claire," Sterling said respectfully. "By the way, I should mention, if your father had lived to see this day, he would be infinitely proud of you. Not just because justice prevailed, but because of how you achieved it. Without breaking a single law, without a single emotional misstep. Exactly as he taught you." Claire felt an unfamiliar warmth well up in her eyes. Not tears of despair, which she never allowed herself, but something deeper. The feeling that a decades-long journey, sparked by a gross injustice against her father, was finally reaching its logical, righteous conclusion. News of the corporate takeover spread through Drake Group headquarters at the speed of light, the kind of speed only corporate gossip achieves in an information vacuum. By that evening, practically every employee, from middle management to the factory floor foreman in Ohio, knew the truth. The real owner of the holding company was Claire. The very woman whose brilliance had kept the lights on for the last 7 years. The very woman who had been humiliatingly escorted out of her office just hours prior. The staff's reaction was near unanimous. Those who had worked under her, who had seen her fairness and meticulousness, who remembered how she shielded blue-collar workers from corrupt vendors, felt a profound sense of relief. It was as if a natural, long-overdue justice had finally been restored. Paige, finding out the news through her connections in the executive admin pool, immediately called Claire. "Claire," she said, her voice a mix of sheer awe and slight intimidation given the scale of what had just occurred. "I am so sorry to bother you at home, but I couldn't not call. The whole office is buzzing." "Is it true? Are you really the owner of the holding company?" "It's true," Claire answered simply. "But how? You worked here for so many years knowing this, and you never even hinted at it." Claire interrupted her gently. Paige, sometimes the most effective strategy is patience and silence, until the perfect moment arrives. My father taught me that long before I even knew this company existed. Today, that moment arrived. Arthur remained alone in the empty executive suite that evening. Ashley, citing urgent family matters, had fled the building the second it became obvious his position was unsalvageable. He sat at his mahogany desk, the same desk where, just that morning, he had thrown insults in Claire's face, trying to process the sheer magnitude of what had happened. He had called the boutique lawyers who had drafted Claire's termination papers, only to be met with bewildered stammering. They admitted the SEC filings from the trust were legally impenetrable, that there was zero basis to challenge the stock consolidation because the shares had been bought legally on the open market long before any conflict of interest arose. Their only advice was to try and negotiate a golden parachute with the new majority shareholder, assuming she was even willing to talk. He remembered standing in front of her hours ago, drunk on his own power, spitting words designed to break her. "Without my last name, you are nothing." He had said it with absolute conviction, never suspecting that in that exact second, the woman standing before him already legally owned the multi-million-dollar corporation bearing his name. A corporation his father had swindled away from her father, and which she through years of honest, grueling labor and the foresight of her deceased dad had taken back. Completely, unconditionally, and legally. Outside his office door, several mid-level managers had gathered, the head of manufacturing, the chief engineer, corporate counsel. Having heard the news, they instinctively gravitated toward the CEO's office, not knowing exactly what to do, but acutely aware that the future of the company was shifting on its axis. One of them, the head of manufacturing who had been there for 20 years and remembered how Claire had saved his floor manager, said quietly, but loud enough for the others to hear. "If Claire is the real owner, then things are finally going to run the way they were always supposed to." No one argued with him. The irony was so bitter that Arthur, sitting alone in the dark office, felt real, visceral fear for the first time in his life. Fear of a future where his last name, which he had been so deeply proud of, was completely powerless against the will and patience of a person he had underestimated his entire life. The 5 days separating Claire's firing from the emergency shareholder meeting felt like an eternity to Arthur. He bounced between trying to deploy back-channel negotiators, consulting with high-priced defense attorneys who all told him the exact same depressing reality: the takeover was unbreakable, and having strained phone calls with his father. Vance Drake, severely limited by his stroke, could offer nothing but useless advice and thinly veiled irritation at his own helplessness. When Vance Drake heard the name Russell in relation to the new corporate owner, he fell into a long, heavy silence. The silence of a man who, 20 years later, finally realizes that the past he thought was buried in concrete had returned to collect the absolute maximum penalty for his sins. "She's Ian's daughter," Vance finally rasped, his voice weak. Of course it's her." He didn't elaborate to his son. He didn't tell him the whole truth about how he had forced his partner out for pennies, the forged documents, the extortion of an honest man. But something in his voice, a deep exhaustion mixed with an ancient, suppressed guilt, made Arthur wonder for the first time in his life if his father had committed a sin far worse than the standard corporate dispute he had been told about as a child. However, Arthur had rapidly running out of time for philosophical reflections. The day of the board meeting had arrived. And with it, the final reckoning. The extraordinary shareholder meeting was held in the main conference room at headquarters. The very room where Claire had spent years presenting Q3 financials, running strategy meetings, and where, years ago, she had silently handed a cocky executive proof of his $500,000 mistake. This time, she entered the room in an entirely different capacity. She took the seat at the head of the table. Not by force, not by corporate espionage, but by the right of law and justice restored after decades. Beside her sat Harrison Sterling, ready to verify the legal infallibility of every document. Down the sides of the table sat the independent board members, including Andrew Crawford, who gave her a respectful nod. Arthur took a seat at the far end of the table, not at the head for the first time in years, but in a chair usually reserved for mid-level managers reporting to the board. He looked exhausted, his face drawn, dark circles under his eyes. 5 sleepless nights had taken their toll. Claire called the meeting to order in a restrained, highly professional tone. There was no gloating, no triumph in her voice. She knew all too well that behaving like a victor would demean both her and her father's memory. Distinguished members of the board, she began. This emergency meeting has been convened due to circumstances requiring immediate intervention. Before moving to a formal vote, I will briefly outline the timeline of events that brought us here today, accompanied by the evidentiary files, sitting in the folders in front of you. She laid out the facts methodically, devoid of emotional coloring. The regional M&A deal. The $3 million in hidden liabilities ignored by the boutique law firm. The scheme of fictional entertainment expenses billed through a shell LLC. The illegal, unapproved corporate bonuses wired to Ashley, whose VP position was created outside of HR protocols and bypassed board approval entirely. She briefly touched upon the procedural violations surrounding her own termination, stressing that she had no intention of filing a personal wrongful termination lawsuit, as the company's integrity required a much more systemic cleanup than an individual labor dispute. The aggregate financial damage inflicted on this corporation by the chief executive officer over the past 24 months, according to a preliminary forensic audit, stands at roughly $3.2 million, she concluded. Therefore, as the majority shareholder, I motion the board to formally vote on the termination of Arthur Drake for cause, effectively immediately, stripping him of all executive powers, severances, and board seats. Furthermore, I propose the corporation pursue civil litigation against Mr. Drake for breach of fiduciary duty to recover the stolen capital. Dead silence filled the room. Arthur tried to object. He babbled about collective decision-making, claimed the profit and loss statements were generally positive, and argued that personal marital issues shouldn't cloud professional judgment. But his arguments sounded pathetic against the backdrop of the bulletproof financial audits Claire's team had placed in front of every director. You set this all up, Arthur finally snapped, losing the last shreds of his composure. You waited years for the perfect moment to destroy me. I spent years doing my job, Arthur, Claire replied calmly, not raising her voice a single decibel. And you spent years pretending to do yours. That was always the difference between us. It had absolutely nothing to do with anyone's last name. Andrew Crawford took the floor immediately after her. His statement essentially sealed the room's mood. Arthur, with all due respect, I worked with your father. And I knew Ian Russell. I can state with absolute certainty that what is happening today is not revenge, and it is not a hostile corporate takeover, no matter how you try to spin it. It is the restoration of justice that was violated over 20 years ago. As someone who has watched this story unfold from day one, I consider it my fiduciary and moral duty to second the motion for your immediate termination for cause. The vote was practically unanimous. Only the one board member with deep Drake family ties abstained, not even voting against, realizing how legally futile such a stance would be. Arthur Drake was officially fired from the company his father had stolen from an honest man, the company he himself had brought to the brink of financial disaster using someone else's labor. He left the building that day in silence, without saying goodbye to a single person. At the lobby exit where just weeks ago, Claire had walked out with her termination papers, he now stood with a cardboard box of personal belongings. Dozens of employees watched from the glass partitions, witnessing the end of an era. Not a single person offered him a word of sympathy. No one walked him to his car. The bitter irony of the scene, a flawless mirror image of the humiliation he had orchestrated for Claire, did not escape him. Before walking out the revolving doors, he stopped, looked up at the corporate logo, still bearing his last name, and without a word, got into his car and drove away. The legal and financial fallout for Arthur proved far more severe than just losing his job. Following the board meeting, the company launched a full-scale forensic audit involving federal authorities. A month later, the district attorney's office, having received the findings, indicted Arthur Drake and Ashley for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. The investigation proved the bonus scheme was a premeditated effort to defraud corporate shareholders using falsified expense reports. During his deposition, which Sterling later relayed to Claire, Arthur tried to claim the expenses were within his discretionary power as CEO. The federal prosecutor, however, dropped the HR bylaws on the table, proving Ashley's position didn't exist in the approved corporate hierarchy, and the wires bypassed all mandatory financial controls. Do you understand, Mr. Drake? The prosecutor asked, that forging internal financial documents to enrich a subordinate is not a corporate faux pas, but a federal felony, regardless of your title? Arthur, according to the corporate counsel present, had no answer. Simultaneously, Drake Group filed a massive civil suit to claw back the $3.2 million in damages. Arthur, facing the terrifying reality of actual legal consequences for the first time in his life, consequences that his family's money could no longer magically erase, found himself in an unthinkable position. His father was too sick to help. His country club buddies immediately distanced themselves to avoid the PR fallout. And Paige, facing potential accessory charges, quickly flipped and provided state's evidence in exchange for immunity, delivering the final, fatal blow to Arthur's defense. Having restored justice, Claire did not take the CEO position for herself. She understood perfectly well that combining the roles of majority shareholder and operational CEO created a conflict of interest and damaged long-term corporate governance. Instead, she initiated a transparent, national executive search for a new CEO, retaining the title of chairman of the board. This allowed her to dictate macro strategy without getting bogged down in daily operations. After a rigorous search, the board hired a seasoned manufacturing executive from Ohio, a man with a flawless reputation and absolutely zero ties to the Drake family. At their first meeting, Claire didn't give him a long lecture. She simply outlined 3 core principles. Decisions are made based on data, not country club connections. Employees are never to be humiliated, even when they make a mistake. And all vendor contracts must be so transparent you wouldn't sweat showing them to a federal judge. You'll figure the rest out on your own. But those 3 things are non-negotiable. Ignoring them is what nearly killed this company. Under the new CEO and Claire's strategic oversight, the company stabilized. The toxic M&A deal was restructured, bad assets were liquidated, and the recovered capital was immediately pumped back into R&D and manufacturing modernization, the very modernization her father had fought for. The new CEO was a boots-on-the-ground leader. In his first 6 months, he visited every single manufacturing plant in the Rust Belt, talking to union reps and floor engineers who hadn't seen a C-suite executive in a decade. This instantly stabilized the workforce and stopped the brain drain the board had feared. Almost a year had passed since the day Arthur threw those venomous words in her face. Remembering that moment, Claire sometimes caught herself feeling a strange, philosophical irony. His arrogant phrase had turned out to be a prophecy, just in reverse. Without his last name, which she legally dropped during the divorce, returning to Russell, she hadn't lost anything. She had gained exactly what belonged to her family by right all along. The legal battles dragged on. The civil suit was in appeals, and Arthur eventually took a plea deal for the wire fraud to avoid maximum federal prison time. He served a heavily reduced sentence, but becoming a convicted felon permanently banned him from serving as an officer of any publicly traded or major private company. After his release, he moved out of state and took a low-level management job at a strip mall construction firm. Hearing this through the grapevine, Claire felt neither gloating nor pity. Just the cold realization that justice, for all its severity, is always proportional. Ashley took a plea deal, receiving probation and a massive restitution fine, as her lawyer successfully argued Arthur was the mastermind. Claire never asked what happened to her after that. She simply ceased to exist in Claire's reality. Vance Drake died 2 years after the takeover, never fully recovering from his stroke. Shortly before his death, he sent Claire a letter short, written in a shaky, weak hand, in which he finally admitted his guilt regarding her father, without excuses or attempts to mitigate his sins. Claire kept the letter, not as a trophy, but as the final period at the end of a very long sentence that had spanned 2 decades. The corporation, with Claire at the helm of the board, established an annual STEM scholarship fund in Ian Russell's name. Claire personally met with each cohort of engineering students. She didn't tell them the story of her corporate triumph, but rather a simple truth she had learned the hard way. Your worth never depends on someone else's last name, someone else's status, or someone else's opinion of you. It depends entirely on whether you have the patience to wait for your moment, maintaining your integrity and a cool head, even when the entire world seems rigged against you. One of the first recipients of the fund was a young engineering grad named Maya Brilliant, but suffering from severe imposter syndrome, having grown up in a family that minimized her achievements. During a Q&A, Maya timidly asked Claire if she had ever been terrified of losing everything by playing such a long, risky game. "I was terrified," Claire answered honestly. But the fear of losing something that doesn't rightfully belong to you is a terrible advisor. The fear of losing your own dignity by submitting to injustice, that is the only fear worth listening to. Remember that, if someone ever tries to convince you that without them, you are nothing. Maya remembered those words for the rest of her life. Drake Group, soon to be rebranded back to Keystone Industries, continued to expand, pushing corrupt competitors out of the market through superior logistics and transparent bidding. In the lobby of the corporate headquarters, where massive oil portraits of Vance and Arthur Drake once hung, there was now a simple bronze plaque dedicating the building to Ian Russell, co-founder of the enterprise. His name had finally taken its rightful place in the history of the company. In the evenings, returning to her home, the same Pennsylvania estate she had split in the divorce and later bought back entirely, Claire would sit on her porch with a glass of Cabernet and look out at the gardens she had planted herself. Methodically, without rushing, step by step. Just as she had rebuilt her father's legacy, she was free. Not because she had exacted revenge or proven she was right, but because, after so many years, she was finally the undisputed master of her own fate. A fate that someone had once tried to steal from her family, but ultimately failed to keep. Sometimes on the weekends, Paige, now the VP of Human Resources, having been promoted by Claire the second the takeover was complete, would come over. They would sit on that porch for hours, discussing not just SEC filings and corporate policy, but simple things, books, vacations, life. In those moments, Claire felt acutely how much more valuable this quiet, unpretentious life was compared to the loud, fake existence she had led next to a man who had decided he had the right to humiliate her. And whenever an industry peer, having learned the true story of the takeover, asked if she regretted the years she spent in silent endurance, Claire always gave the exact same answer. Patience and submission are two completely different things. "I never allowed anyone to humiliate me. I just knew how to wait for the moment when the truth would force its way to the surface. And it did."